One of the true marks of human evolution, of compassion, and of humanity's orientation towards the common good, author Gareth Higgins says, is when people nominally in the centre, which is more or less us, cease to exclude those on the margins. So when those in the centre don't exclude those on the margins, it's a sign of our evolution and compassion and seeking of the common good. And he used a very straightforward example that 40 plus years ago, in my lifetime, only a small percentage of buildings were wheelchair accessible. Now it is in the building code that all public buildings need disability access. We can probably think of many other examples as well. The rights of LGBTIQ plus people to marry, or in many of our lifetimes as well, the 1966 referendum, which saw Aboriginal people no longer classed as flora and fauna, but as human beings with a right to vote. For South Africa, it was the overcoming of apartheid. I wonder if for the journey of Israelis and Palestinians, it is to see the humanity and the right to exist and the right to flourish in the other that they live alongside. What we know is that this change of opening up the centre to all takes generations, but we will eventually get there. So I want to keep the same image in our mind of a move from the outside to the centre, but imagine the wheel of a push bike with the hub and the spokes, and think of it in the context of our spiritual lives this time. We start out on the rim, and our spiritual journey is represented by a movement towards the centre, which is God. The 6th century saint, Dorotheos of Gaza, says the closer we get to God in the centre, the closer we get to one another. The spokes all meet in the centre. And the closer we get to one another, the closer we get to God. So the mark of our human evolution and spiritual journey into the divine life of God is one of relationship, of loving God and loving neighbour, Jesus would neatly surmise. If we move towards God, we are inevitably moving towards our neighbour and moving towards the other, one who is different from us. I wonder if the key then to achieving this movement is humility. Humility, Joan Chittister says, is the basis for right relationships in the spiritual life, because it causes us to know our place in the universe, our interconnectedness, and our dependence on God. I wonder if, more than anything after the outcome of the referendum, what this nation needs is a period of deep humility. St. Paul had humility, it seems. In one of his more often quoted verses from the passage in today's letter to the Philippians, he writes, "I can do all things through him who strengthens me." It's the first verse I ever memorised as an adult Christian who'd come back to church, and I wrote it inside the cover of my diary and my journal and on pretty much every piece of paper I used, just as a wonderful gift of encouragement. It recognises that God is the source of everything, including our own strength and our own ability to overcome fear and trepidation in life. But note that that verse is also followed in this very conversational and relational letter with the Philippians. In any case, it was kind of you to share my distress. They'd been worried about him, and sharing in his distress, not just noting it but feeling it. This week, many of us have shared the distress of others. The distress of Israelis in response to the horrific attacks by Hamas on innocent civilians, innocent children and the elderly. The distress of Palestinians in Gaza as thousands have been killed in retaliatory bombings, including over 500 children dead. Those in Gaza are now without homes, without power, without water, without food, and without an open border to escape the violence. They are trapped in the world's largest open-air prison, which has had over 6,000 bombs dropped on it in a week. This is a city half the size of Canberra with 2.1 million people living in it. And that's more bombs than the US dropped in Afghanistan in an entire year. Closer to home, many of us have shared the distress of our Aboriginal brothers and sisters, firstly at the tenor of the debate surrounding the referendum. And if you spent any time here at pre-polling during the week, you would have been shocked like I was at what I heard. But many of us will also shared last night and this day the outcome of the referendum. It seems as a country, those of us who have only arrived late on its soil in the last 250 years seem more intent on protecting the centre and keeping others out on the margins, out on the rim, even if they've been living here for 65,000 years. So we still have a ways to go in our evolution as a society. And I lament the fact it might be our children doing this work of reconciliation in future. So moving forward, whether we voted yes or voted no, it would be good for us as a society in our spiritual lives to practice some humility, to trust, like St. Paul, that we can do what needs to be done through the God who strengthens us, that the work that the voice set out to achieve, we now have to achieve by other means, starting with listening, active listening to the First Nations people of this country. But it's not insurmountable, because it is God who strengthens us for this work ahead. We can achieve unity and be compassionate if we live vulnerably enough for God to work through us. And to do that, we need to not live in fear of God. Or let me put it another way. We can live in the fear of the awesomeness of God, the otherness of God, the overwhelming glory and light and mercy and love of God. That can be so awe-inspiring, we can be in fear and trembling, as the scriptures say. But we need not live in fear of God's anger or wrath. That was overcome on the cross. What we have in the cross and resurrection of Christ is an invitation towards the centre of the wheel, towards God. And we're following Jesus, all of us, because he's already made that movement himself in human flesh. He moved through death to life in order that we no longer fear death. And if we no longer fear death, we can do all things through God who strengthens us. And it means we can do more than just share the distress of others. Because when our God of love and mercy strengthens us, it is him who is working through us. So the psalmist sings, "Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me." And the prophet Isaiah says, "On the holy mountain, at a great feast, God will swallow up death forever. and then the Lord God will wipe away the tears from all our faces. We believe that in Jesus Christ, God has swallowed up death forever. Which means as we approach this very difficult parable in today's gospel, we don't need to do so in fear and trembling. I think when we hear this parable read, it is human nature to read it in an allegory where we imagine the king in this parable is God. But we do not have to read it that way. This king who metes out retributive violence on a town because they would not come to the wedding feast, who burns it to the ground. It seems an anathema to those of us who know God as loving and merciful and kind. We do not have to fear being one of the latter guests, invited, pulled off the street and invited, and who are unprepared, wearing the wrong garment to the wedding and then being cast out by this angry king. When we arrive at the great marriage feast of the Lamb, of which every Eucharist is a dress rehearsal, a foretaste, God has already put on the robe we are to wear. It is the robe of our baptism, the white robe of our baptism, and it already fits perfectly. There's an interpretive key for this gospel I'd like us to consider, this parable. The first is in Matthew chapter 11, verse 12. Jesus says, "The kingdom of heaven suffers violence and suffers it to this day." The kingdom of heaven doesn't mete out violence, it suffers it. The second is just a brief textual note about what the translators have done for us in this reading. At the very beginning of the parable, it says, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet." But the translators decided to leave out a word, or two words. In the original text it says, "a man, a king." So what does that mean when we hear it? The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man, a king. I think Jesus is saying you don't have to imagine this king as God. Think of him as a man, as a worldly king. Look at what he does and say, oh, does this make sense in terms of the worldly kings you know? So in the time of Jesus, would that be like Herod? Yep. That's exactly the violence he would have meted out on the people of Israel when he came to marry the daughter of the high priest, and they all turned their back on him and said, "We're not turning up to that." That's what he did. Does it sound like a Vladimir Putin, an Idi Amin, a Saddam Hussein, I could keep going, heaven forbid, a Benjamin Netanyahu, the leaders of Hamas? Does the king sound like them more than God? I think so. So then, when we come to a parable, then we ask, well, where's God in this? Where is Jesus in this parable? Where are we in this parable? There's this odd character who turns up at the wedding banquet wearing the wrong robe. And this story comes in Matthew's Gospel after the entry of Jesus into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, and it's not long before his own trial and crucifixion. So if you think to Jesus' trial, if you think to him standing in his seamless tunic before the authorities, and when they interrogate him, what does he say? Nothing. He stands in silence like this man interrogated by the king at the wedding banquet. And what happens to Jesus? He is cast out, hand and foot, outside the city walls, where he is crucified, and his friends, his mother, kneel at his feet as he dies weeping and gnashing their teeth. The kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and it suffered violence on the cross, but the cross is not the end of the story. Jesus redeems us through the suffering of violence, not the meting it out. Which means God's power and God's authority does not look like human power and authority. It does not look like what's going on in the Holy Land. The bombing of innocents, the holding at arm's length from the centre an entire race of people. The kingdom of heaven looks like Jesus. It looks like humility to die on a cross. And it looks like the love and forgiveness that is born to bear in the resurrection. So today, as war and injustice continues to make its mark on the world, dividing and consigning many to the rim, we can share the distress of others. We can feel it deep in our guts and our core. But then in the same humility of Christ and in the power of the God who strengthens us, we can actively resist the violence of the world. We can overcome oppression and injustice by moving towards one another and moving towards God as we do so. And we do it all rejoicing in the crucified and risen Lord, gathered around this altar this day. The Lord be